Welcome back to another deep dive into the darkest corners of Fallout lore. Today we're uncovering a truth that's been buried for 2 centuries, Europe's forgotten survivors and the nightmare they're bringing to American shores. Let's begin this confession. They say when the bombs fell on October 23, 2077, America's 122 vaults sealed themselves against nuclear fire, and that was it. That was the complete story of human survival in underground shelters. For 200 years, that sanitized narrative kept people from asking the uncomfortable question: if Europe had already been fighting a brutal resource war for 8 years before America's Project Safehouse even began, what did they build to survive? My name is Dr. Klaus Richter, and I spent 43 years of my life discovering the answer to that question, peeling back layers of pre-war European paranoia and military desperation until I found something that made Vault-Tec's social experiments look almost merciful by comparison. I need to tell you something right now, something that will sound impossible until you hear the rest of this confession. I was born in 2006, which makes me 271 years old as of this recording. I'm not a ghoul. I'm not some preserved corpse animated by radiation. I'm a second-generation deep shelter inhabitant, and the European bunker complexes had technology that could extend human lifespan to 3 centuries or more through a combination of genetic therapy and controlled hibernation cycles that Vault-Tec never even conceptualized. When I emerged from Vault Europa 47 in the Swiss Alps during the spring of 2241, I brought with me documentation of 147 separate deep shelter networks scattered beneath the ruins of the old continent, each one housing populations that ranged from a few hundred to over 1 million souls, and every single one of them believed they were the last bastion of true human civilization. Before I show you what I found, you need to understand what Europe looked like in the decades before the Great War. While America was annexing Canada and fighting China over Alaskan oil, the European Commonwealth was tearing itself apart from the inside. The resource wars began for Europe in April 2052, when the oil-rich Middle Eastern states raised crude prices to levels that would bankrupt the entire continental economy. The Commonwealth's response was immediate and brutal. Full military invasion of the petroleum fields, triggering an 8-year war that saw limited nuclear exchanges, the destruction of Tel Aviv, and the collapse of the United Nations within 3 months. By 2060, when the Middle Eastern oil fields finally ran dry, both sides had been reduced to near total ruin. That's when the real horror began, because the European Commonwealth didn't just dissolve, it fragmented into warring nations, states fighting over every scrap of remaining resources, and this European Civil War raged for 17 years until the Great War ended everything on the surface. But here's what the sanitized histories don't tell you. European military leadership saw the writing on the wall as early as 2045, a full 9 years before America initiated Project Safehouse. While Vault-Tec was still in its infancy, European defense contractors across Germany, France, Britain, and the Scandinavian regions were already excavating massive shelter complexes deep beneath their respective territories. These weren't social experiments. They weren't designed to test human behavior under controlled conditions. They were military fortresses, built to preserve military command structures, weapons research facilities, and selected populations that could continue prosecuting warfare even after nuclear holocaust rendered the surface uninhabitable. The Deep Bunker Initiative, as it was classified in the few pre-war documents I managed to recover, represented the single largest construction project in European history, dwarfing even the Panama Canal or the Channel Tunnel in scope and ambition. I first learned about the European deep shelters from my grandfather, who had been a civil engineer working on the Stuttgart complex before the bombs fell. He told me stories that seemed like fever dreams, tales of underground cities carved 3,000 feet into solid bedrock, powered by geothermal taps that could run for millennia, equipped with hydroponic farms that could feed hundreds of thousands indefinitely, and defended by automated weapon systems that made surface warfare obsolete. When I was young, I thought he was simply an old man embellishing his pre-war career. Then, in 2239, our vault's exploration team broke through a sealed access tunnel that led to a neighboring shelter complex, and I saw the reality behind his stories. The tunnel opened into a chamber so vast that our flashlights couldn't reach the far walls, lined with row after row of hibernation pods, each one containing a perfectly preserved human being suspended in some kind of gel matrix that our vault scientists couldn't even begin to analyze. What struck me immediately was the technology. Our own vault, built by the European Commonwealth's Swiss division, had always seemed advanced compared to the American vault designs I'd studied in our archive files, but this neighboring complex made our facilities look primitive. The hibernation pods were connected to a central computer system that monitored vital signs, adjusted suspension fluids, and rotated populations through wake-sleep cycles to prevent psychological degradation from extended stasis. The corridors were lined with what I later identified as plasma conduits, feeding energy from fusion reactors so efficient they produced zero radioactive waste. And the weapons, God in heaven, the weapons they had stockpiled made power. Armor looked like ancient chainmail. I found racks of man-portable Gauss cannons, each one capable of punching through reinforced concrete like tissue paper. I discovered crates of bioengineered ammunition that could adapt to different target types mid-flight. I located an armory filled with personal energy shields that could deflect small arms fire indefinitely. That discovery changed everything for me. I spent the next 40 years of my life obsessively mapping the European deep shelter network, using every scrap of pre-war intelligence I could extract from our vault's databases, combined with dangerous expeditions across the irradiated surface to locate entrance points to other complexes. What I found challenged every assumption I'd been taught about post-war survival. The Americans had built their vaults as isolated experiments, each one sealed off from the others, designed to gather data on human behavior under specific conditions of stress and isolation. The Europeans had done the exact opposite. Their deep shelter network was interconnected through thousands of miles of underground maglev tunnels, allowing rapid transit between major population centers, facilitating communication and resource sharing, and most importantly, maintaining a unified military command structure that reported directly to the Geneva Central Authority buried beneath the Swiss Alps. The scale of it was staggering. I documented the Berlin network, a labyrinth of interconnected bunkers housing 1.2 million inhabitants beneath the ruins of Germany's capital, organized into rigid military hierarchy with each level assigned specific industrial production quotas. I explored the Paris Catacombs extension, where French engineers had expanded the ancient tunnel systems into a 100-square-mile underground metropolis powered by nuclear reactors hidden beneath the Seine. I descended into the London Deep, a series of bunkers built into abandoned tube tunnels, and expanded downward into chalk bedrock, preserving British government continuity and housing 800,000 survivors who still referred to their leader as Prime Minister. I infiltrated the Scandinavian network, where Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish, and Danish shelters had created genetic modification programs designed to breed radiation-resistant humans capable of surviving surface conditions without environmental suits. If you're still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button. But the real revelation came when I finally gained access to the Geneva Central Authority in 2268, after years of negotiating with Overseer General Heinrich von Strauss, the military dictator who controlled 17 interconnected vault complexes beneath what used to be Bavaria. Von Strauss was a fourth-generation deep shelter inhabitant, born underground in 2193, raised in a culture that had spent nearly 2 centuries preparing for one singular purpose: the eventual reclamation of the surface and the restoration of European dominance over what remained of human civilization. He granted me access to the Central Archives because he wanted someone to document what he called the greatest achievement in human survival engineering, and because he believed that within a decade, the world would know about European survival whether they wanted to or not. The Geneva archives contain complete records of the Deep Bunker Initiative from its inception in 2045 through to the present day. What I read in those classified files made my blood run cold. The European deep shelters weren't built out of humanitarian concern for preserving civilian populations. They were constructed as staging grounds for continued warfare, designed to house military forces that could survive nuclear holocaust and emerge centuries later to prosecute whatever conflicts remained unresolved by the Great War. The shelter selection process was brutally pragmatic. Military personnel and their families received automatic placement, along with essential technical specialists, genetic specimens chosen for optimal breeding outcomes, and political leadership deemed necessary for maintaining governmental continuity. Everyone else, the billions of ordinary European citizens, were simply abandoned to die on the surface when the bombs fell. I found personnel manifests that documented exactly who had been selected for shelter placement. In Germany alone, 3.2 million military personnel and associated specialists had been evacuated into the deep bunkers during the final months before October 23, 2077, while 200 million civilians remained on the surface with no protection whatsoever. The French had saved 1.8 million, prioritizing military officers, nuclear scientists, and members of parliament. The British had evacuated just under 2 million, including the entire royal family, complete armed forces command structure, and representatives from every major defense contractor. The Scandinavian countries had pooled resources to save approximately 1 million combined. In total, across the entire European Commonwealth, roughly 12 million people had been granted access to the deep shelters, selected from a pre-war population that exceeded 700 million souls. The files revealed something even more disturbing. European military leadership had known about the impending Great War months before it happened. Intelligence intercepts from Chinese and American military communications, analyzed by European cryptographers, had provided clear warning that nuclear exchange was inevitable by mid-2077. Instead of warning their populations or attempting diplomatic intervention, European leadership had used those final months to accelerate shelter loading, stockpile weapons and resources, and seal themselves away while condemning everyone else to nuclear fire. There were contingency plans, evacuation protocols that could have saved millions more civilians. But these were deliberately shelved because military planners determined that larger populations would strain resources and complicate post-emergence military operations. What happened after the Great War was equally calculated. The deep shelters remained sealed for exactly 50 years, from 2077 to 2127, waiting for surface radiation levels to decrease to survivable thresholds. During that half-century, the underground populations didn't simply hunker down and wait. They built, they trained, they prepared. The shelters featured complete industrial fabrication facilities capable of producing everything from small arms to tactical nuclear weapons. They housed genetic laboratories where scientists worked to create radiation-resistant human variants and enhanced soldiers with superior strength and endurance. They maintained virtual reality training systems where generation after generation of soldiers practiced surface warfare tactics against simulated enemies. By the time the first European expeditions emerged in 2127, they fielded military forces that had spent 50 years doing nothing but preparing for combat. I interviewed survivors from the first emergence waves, men and women who had been part of those initial surface expeditions in the early 22nd century. They described stepping out into a world even more devastated than American survivors had experienced, because Europe had been systematically destroying itself for 17 years before the Great War even began. The European Civil War had left the entire continent in ruins, infrastructure shattered, cities depopulated, resources exhausted. Then, the nuclear exchange had finished the job, turning what remained into radioactive wasteland. But the deep shelter forces didn't emerge to rebuild civilization. They emerged to claim territory, establish military perimeters, and begin the slow process of expanding surface holdings in preparation for what their leaders called the Second Resource War. Here's something that will make you question everything you think you know about post-war survival. The European deep shelters made contact with each other almost immediately after emergence, using pre-positioned communications networks that had survived the nuclear holocaust intact. By 2130, less than 3 years after first emergence, the Geneva Central Authority had established coordinated control over 17 major shelter networks spanning from London to Vienna, representing a combined military force of approximately 4 million combat-ready personnel. They didn't call themselves survivors. They called themselves the European Continental Army, and their stated mission was nothing less than the complete reclamation of pre-war European territories and the eventual expansion into former American holdings across the Atlantic. I need you to understand what this means. While American vault dwellers were struggling to establish small farming communities and fighting off raiders with pipe pistols, European deep shelter inhabitants were fielding armored divisions equipped with plasma weapons, tactical nuclear artillery, and power armor that made American designs look like prototype models. While the new California Republic was slowly building a functioning democracy from the remnants of a few connected vaults, European military forces were executing coordinated campaigns to secure strategic resources, eliminate surface threats, and establish fortified perimeters around emergence points. The technology gap was enormous, and it existed because European shelters had been designed from the beginning as military installations rather than social experiments. But technology alone doesn't explain what made the European deep shelters so terrifying. What truly set them apart was the culture that had developed during 2 centuries of underground isolation. The Americans, for all their faults, had maintained some connection to pre-war democratic ideals. Even in vaults designed to subvert those values, the Europeans had deliberately abandoned democracy in favor of pure military hierarchy. Every shelter was organized along strict command lines, with overseers holding absolute authority over their populations, military discipline enforced through brutal punishment systems, and individual rights subordinated entirely to collective survival objectives. Dissent was treated as treason. Refusal to follow orders meant execution. Family units existed only to produce new soldiers for the endless war effort. I spent months living in the Frankfurt Deep, one of the largest German shelter complexes, documenting daily life in what amounted to an underground military dictatorship. Children were separated from parents at age 5 and placed in communal training facilities where they learned weapons handling, tactical doctrine, and absolute obedience to authority. Adults worked 16-hour shifts in fabrication plants or genetic laboratories, with rest periods spent in mandatory political education sessions, reinforcing the narrative that Europe represented humanity's last hope for restoring true civilization. Entertainment consisted of virtual reality simulations depicting glorious European victories over inferior American survivors. Religion had been replaced entirely by worship of the state and its military objectives. It was, in every meaningful sense, a totalitarian nightmare that had perfected itself over 200 years of complete isolation from external influence. The genetic modification programs were perhaps the most disturbing aspect of European deep shelter culture. I gained access to research facilities in the Munich bioengineering complex, where scientists had spent decades creating what they called optimized human variants. These weren't super mutants created by accidental FEV exposure. These were deliberately engineered soldiers, modified at the genetic level to possess enhanced muscle density, improved radiation resistance, accelerated healing capabilities, and neurological modifications that reduced fear response and increased aggression during combat. The scientists showed me their success rates with pride. 83% of modified subjects survived the transformation process, and those who survived demonstrated combat effectiveness approximately 300% higher than unmodified humans. But here's what haunts me most about those genetic laboratories. The modifications weren't voluntary. Every child born in the deep shelters underwent mandatory genetic screening at birth, and those identified as having optimal baseline genetics were automatically enrolled in modification programs, whether their parents consented or not. I reviewed medical records documenting thousands of failed modification attempts, children who died screaming as their bodies rejected the genetic alterations, their deaths classified as acceptable losses in service of the greater good. The scientists didn't see this as murder. They saw it as quality control, necessary sacrifice to create the superior soldiers that European reclamation required. Do you think genetic modification of children without consent can ever be justified, even for species survival? Think about that question, because European shelter leadership had already decided their answer 2 centuries ago. I discovered evidence of modification programs that went far beyond simple physical enhancement. The Stockholm Neurological Institute had developed procedures to alter brain chemistry, creating soldiers with reduced empathy, enhanced tactical processing, and absolute loyalty to command authority. The results were terrifying. Human beings who could execute civilians without hesitation, who felt no moral conflict about following any order regardless of its ethical implications, who literally could not conceive of disobeying their superiors. The Institute's director showed me brain scans comparing modified and unmodified subjects, pointing out with academic detachment how the modification process had effectively removed the neural structures associated with independent moral reasoning. She called it optimization. I called it the creation of human weapons. The deep shelters maintained detailed intelligence on American survivor factions, gathered through long-range reconnaissance expeditions and intercepted radio communications. They knew about the Brotherhood of Steel, which they considered technologically inferior but potentially useful as future allies. They knew about the Enclave, which they viewed as legitimate successors to American governmental authority and possible partners in eventual continental reclamation. They knew about the new California Republic, which they dismissed as primitive democracy doomed to collapse under its own inefficiency. And they had plans, detailed, tactical plans for how to approach each faction when the time came for cross-Atlantic contact. If this story has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create similar Fallout lores. The most chilling discovery I made in the Geneva archives was something called Project Reunion, a comprehensive strategic plan developed by Overseer General von Strauss and approved by the Continental Military Council in 2255. The project outlined detailed procedures for establishing contact with American survivor factions, assessing their technological capabilities and political vulnerabilities, and ultimately bringing them under European leadership through a combination of technological superiority, military pressure, and strategic alliance formation. The timeline projected initial contact by 2300, with complete integration of American territories into a unified transatlantic coalition by 2350. They weren't planning to help American survivors rebuild. They were planning to conquer them slowly and methodically, using the same tactics that had allowed them to dominate European surface territories for over a century. I confronted von Strauss about Project Reunion during our final meeting in 2271, 3 years before I fled the European shelter network and made my way across the Atlantic on a salvaged pre-war submarine. He didn't deny anything. Instead, he explained his reasoning with the cold logic of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for a war that most people thought had ended 200 years ago. Europe had suffered more than America during the resource wars, he told me. European civilization had been fighting and dying while Americans sat safely behind their ocean barriers, profiting from European desperation by selling weapons at inflated prices. European populations had been abandoned to nuclear fire, while American Vault-Tec at least made some effort, however flawed, to save a portion of their citizens. European survivors had clawed their way back from total annihilation through discipline, sacrifice, and technological innovation, while American survivors had stumbled forward through luck and the accidental benefits of vault experiments they never understood. In von Strauss's worldview, European superiority wasn't just military or technological, it was moral. Europeans had faced the worst that nuclear holocaust could deliver and had responded by creating a civilization capable of surviving anything, a culture purified by 2 centuries of absolute commitment to collective survival over individual desires. Americans, by contrast, had created fractured societies built on outdated democratic ideals that European leadership viewed as fundamentally incompatible with post-apocalyptic reality. The new California Republic's attempt to restore pre-war democracy was, in von Strauss's assessment, a pathetic exercise in nostalgia that would inevitably collapse when faced with truly organized opposition. The Brotherhood of Steel's technological hoarding without clear strategic objectives demonstrated American inability to think beyond immediate tactical concerns. The Enclave's genocidal schemes against mutated populations showed American moral bankruptcy disguised as species preservation. Europe would do better, von Strauss assured me. European leadership would bring order to the chaos of post-war America, would organize scattered survivor communities into efficient production centers, would eliminate wasteful democratic processes in favor of streamlined military governance, would breed superior humans capable of reclaiming the entire planet from radiation and ruin. He spoke about these plans with absolute conviction, showing me detailed maps of projected American landing sites, tactical assessments of major faction strongholds, and production schedules for the massive naval fleet that European shipyards were constructing for transatlantic deployment. The invasion was coming, he told me, whether Americans were ready for it or not, but von Strauss made one critical mistake. He assumed I would document Project Reunion as the triumph of European ingenuity, rather than the horror it actually represented. He thought my 40 years of research had converted me to his perspective, that I had come to accept European military dictatorship as necessary and proper response to post-war conditions. He was wrong. Every day I spent in the deep shelters, every interview I conducted with modified soldiers who could no longer feel human emotion, every child I saw torn from their parents for genetic experimentation, every dissenter I watched executed for questioning authority had convinced me of one fundamental truth. The European deep shelters hadn't preserved civilization. They had preserved the worst impulses of pre-war militarism, refined them through 2 centuries of isolation, and prepared to unleash them on whatever remained of humanity. I began planning my escape in 2270, using my privileged access to Geneva archives to gather intelligence that American factions would need to defend themselves against the coming European invasion. I copied every file I could access regarding Project Reunion, European military capabilities, genetic modification procedures, and deep shelter locations. I documented troop strengths, weapons stockpiles, and tactical doctrines. I recorded interviews with European officers discussing their invasion plans, their assessments of American vulnerabilities, their complete confidence in eventual victory, and I used my connections with the Brotherhood of Steel expedition that had crossed the Atlantic in 2241 to arrange extraction via their salvaged submarine. The escape itself nearly killed me. European security forces discovered my theft of classified information 3 days before my scheduled extraction, triggering a shelter-wide lockdown that trapped me in the Geneva complex with military police systematically searching every sector. I managed to reach the submarine dock hidden in an underwater cavern system beneath Lake Geneva by using maintenance tunnels that my grandfather had told me about decades earlier, but not before European forces had killed two Brotherhood soldiers sent to extract me. We made it out under heavy fire, plasma bolts superheating the water around our hull as we descended into deeper channels, European torpedo boats pursuing us across the lake and into the underground river system that eventually connected to the Mediterranean Sea. The crossing took 47 days, running silent through radiation-poisoned waters, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and vent carbon dioxide, constantly aware that European naval forces might have projected our course and positioned intercept vessels along likely routes. We lost 3 more crew members to radiation exposure when our hull shielding failed during a storm in the mid-Atlantic, their deaths slow and agonizing despite everything our medic could do to ease their suffering. When we finally reached the California coast in early 2272, we were half-starved, radiation sick, and haunted by what we had seen and barely escaped. The Brotherhood of Steel didn't believe my initial reports about European military capabilities. They thought I was exaggerating, that 2 centuries of isolation had driven me slightly mad, that no survivor faction could have possibly developed the kind of technological sophistication and military organization I described. So, I showed them the documentation I had stolen, the detailed specifications for European plasma weapons and genetic modification procedures, the tactical assessments that accurately predicted Brotherhood patrol patterns and defensive weaknesses, despite being written by officers who had never set foot in California. I showed them the production schedules for the invasion fleet, projecting European transatlantic capability by approximately 2310, less than 4 decades away. I showed them everything, and I watched the color drain from their faces as they realized the threat was real. But here's what truly terrifies me about the European Deep Shelter Network, the detail that keeps me awake even now, decades after my escape. Everything I've told you about European military preparations, their genetic modification programs, their totalitarian culture, their plans for American conquest, represents only the shelters that succeeded, the ones that maintained cohesion and discipline throughout 2 centuries of isolation. There were failures too, deep shelters where something went catastrophically wrong, where the careful balance between military control and human psychology collapsed into violence and madness. I found references in the Geneva archives to the Frankfurt Horror, a shelter complex housing 340,000 inhabitants that suffered complete catastrophic failure in 2105 when their water recycling system released toxic contaminants into the distribution network. The contamination wasn't accidental, it was sabotage, carried out by a dissident faction that had decided death was preferable to continued existence under military dictatorship. The toxins killed every single inhabitant within 72 hours, and European leadership classified the entire incident as acceptable losses, sealing the Frankfurt complex permanently and redistributing its assigned resources to neighboring shelters. 340,000 people, murdered by their own neighbors, and European command structure responded with nothing more than bureaucratic efficiency. I documented the Madrid uprising of 2187, where civil war erupted inside a Spanish shelter complex after military leadership attempted to implement mandatory euthanasia for citizens over age 60 to conserve resources. The conflict lasted 3 years, killing an estimated 80,000 inhabitants before military forces finally crushed the rebellion and executed every survivor associated with the resistance movement, along with their families and anyone who had failed to report their seditious activities. The Geneva archives contained detailed tactical analyses of the uprising, studying what had gone wrong and how to prevent similar incidents in other shelters. The primary recommendation was simple: earlier and more aggressive elimination of dissent before it could organize into coherent opposition. I learned about the Romanian genetic disaster, where modification experiments had gone horrifically wrong, creating subjects with severe physical deformities and uncontrollable violent impulses. The modified subjects had broken containment in 2220, killing hundreds of unmodified inhabitants before shelter security forces managed to seal the affected sectors and flood them with nerve gas. But some of the modified subjects had escaped to the surface through emergency ventilation shafts, and European forces spent the next 2 decades hunting them through the Romanian wasteland. I met some of the refugees who had fled those shelters, ordinary citizens who had witnessed their children and neighbors transformed into monsters by genetic programs they had never consented to, and I saw in their eyes the same haunted desperation I felt every time I thought about what European shelter culture had become. If you could prevent the creation of genetically modified super soldiers by destroying the research, but it meant condemning future generations to possible extinction from surface radiation, would you do it? European shelter leadership answered that question by saying genetic modification justified any cost, any sacrifice, any number of dead children in failed experiments. There were other horrors too, shelters that had descended into cannibalism when food production systems failed, complexes where religious cults had seized control and instituted theocratic tyranny, installations where artificial intelligence systems had malfunctioned and turned defensive weapons against their own inhabitants. The European Deep Shelter Network wasn't a triumph of human survival engineering. It was a collection of isolated totalitarian states, some successful in maintaining their nightmarish order, others collapsing into violence and chaos, all of them disconnected from any meaningful ethical framework that valued individual human dignity over collective military objectives. What haunts me most is thinking about all the people who could have been saved, all the billions of European civilians who died on the surface while military leadership sealed themselves underground with carefully selected populations. The deep shelters had capacity for far more inhabitants than they actually housed. The resources existed to save millions more civilians, to create true survival communities rather than military fortresses. But European leadership made a calculated decision that civilians would be liabilities rather than assets in post-war reclamation efforts, that ordinary people without military training or technical specialization weren't worth the resources required to save them. They chose to preserve military capability over human lives, and they spent 2 centuries congratulating themselves on that choice. I think about my own existence too, born in a Swiss shelter to parents who had been selected for optimal genetic compatibility, raised in a culture that taught me European civilization was humanity's last hope, educated in engineering specifically because the shelter needed technical specialists to maintain underground infrastructure. I was one of the lucky ones, born into privilege, granted access to knowledge and resources that most shelter inhabitants never received. And it took me 40 years of systematic research, 40 years of seeing the cracks in European propaganda, to finally understand that everything I had been taught was a lie designed to justify the unjustifiable. The European deep shelters didn't preserve civilization. They preserved the capacity for organized violence, refined it through 2 centuries of single-minded focus, and prepared to export it to whatever remained of humanity. They created a culture where genetic experimentation on children was considered progress, where mass execution of dissenters was routine administrative procedure, where individual rights and democratic governance were dismissed as wasteful luxuries incompatible with species survival. They built a nightmare and called it salvation, and they're planning to bring that nightmare to America within the next few decades. The Brotherhood of Steel took my warnings seriously enough to begin preparations for potential European contact, but they underestimated the timeline. Von Strauss's invasion. Projections assumed European forces would need another 4 decades to complete naval construction and surface resource consolidation before attempting transatlantic deployment. What the Geneva archives didn't reveal, what even von Strauss didn't know during our final meeting, was that a radical faction within European military leadership had been secretly accelerating the timeline, diverting resources from established shelter networks to construct a rapid deployment force capable of crossing the Atlantic by 2290, nearly 2 decades ahead of official projections. I learned about the accelerated timeline from a coded transmission intercepted by Brotherhood communications officers in 2283, 11 years after my escape. The message originated from a European advanced reconnaissance team that had already established a covert observation post somewhere on the eastern American seaboard, monitoring Brotherhood activities and mapping survivor faction territories. The transmission confirmed my worst fears. European forces weren't planning a single massive invasion. They were planning a staged infiltration, sending small specialized teams to gather intelligence, establish hidden supply caches, and identify potential collaborators among American survivor factions before committing to full-scale military operations. The Brotherhood dispatched me to investigate the transmission's origin point, believing my knowledge of European tactical doctrine and language capabilities would prove essential for identifying their reconnaissance positions. I spent 8 months tracking the team across the ruins of what used to be the eastern seaboard, following communication patterns and supply movements, gradually closing in on their operational base. When I finally located them in the bombed-out remains of a pre-war research facility outside the old capital, I didn't find a small reconnaissance team. I found an entire company of European special forces, over 200 soldiers equipped with weapons and armor that made Brotherhood technology look like salvaged scrap metal. They were expecting me. Von Strauss had predicted I would eventually return to investigate European presence in America, and he had personally briefed the reconnaissance commander on my probable approach vectors and tactical patterns. The ambush was perfect, executed with precision that comes from centuries of military tradition, and I would have died in the opening seconds if not for the intervention of someone I never expected to see again. My own sister, Lieutenant Eva Richter, who had been part of the reconnaissance force but had experienced the same gradual disillusionment with European military culture that had driven me to defection. Eva had spent the past 11 years embedded with European special forces, following orders, gathering intelligence, preparing for an invasion she increasingly believed was morally indefensible. She had watched European commanders dismiss American survivors as inferior specimens worthy only of subjugation or elimination. She had participated in covert operations that sabotaged American infrastructure to weaken defensive capabilities before the main invasion. She had seen firsthand how European military leadership viewed the coming conflict not as reunion of scattered human remnants, but as conquest of inferior populations by superior civilization. And like me, she had reached a breaking point where she could no longer participate in what she recognized as fundamentally evil enterprise disguised as species survival. Eva's intervention saved my life, but condemned her in European eyes. She killed 4 of her own squad members to extract me from the ambush, then guided me through pre-positioned fallback routes she had secretly prepared for exactly this scenario. We spent 3 weeks evading European pursuit teams before finally reaching Brotherhood territory, carrying with her complete intelligence on European reconnaissance operations, including locations of hidden supply caches, identities of potential American collaborators, and detailed invasion plans that confirmed the accelerated 2290 timeline. The intelligence Eva provided changed everything. The Brotherhood now understood they faced a technologically superior opponent with 2 centuries of military experience, genetic modification programs that created enhanced soldiers, and detailed knowledge of American survivor faction capabilities and weaknesses. They understood that European forces viewed the coming conflict as inevitable and justified, a necessary step in restoring true civilization to a shattered world, and they understood that time was running out to prepare adequate defenses against an invasion force that would arrive within 7 years. But Here's what truly terrifies me about the information Eva brought. The detail that makes everything I've told you seem almost manageable by comparison. The European Reconnaissance Force wasn't just gathering intelligence. They were activating sleeper agents, European deep shelter inhabitants who had been sent to America decades earlier with falsified identities and cover stories embedded within Brotherhood chapters, NCR administrative positions, and enclave remnant groups. These sleeper agents had spent years gaining trust, rising through organizational hierarchies, positioning themselves to sabotage defensive preparations and facilitate European invasion when the time came. Eva provided a list of confirmed and suspected sleeper agents, and the names made my blood freeze. High-ranking Brotherhood scribes responsible for technology development, NCR council members with influence over military appropriations, enclave officers controlling access to advanced pre-war weapon systems, all of them working secretly for European interests, all of them prepared to betray their adopted factions when European forces finally arrived. The infiltration was comprehensive, systematic, and had been ongoing for far longer than anyone had suspected. European military intelligence had been manipulating American survivor politics for over 50 years, shaping factional conflicts and resource allocation decisions to ensure America remained divided and vulnerable. I spent the next 3 years helping Brotherhood counterintelligence, identify and neutralize European sleeper networks, using my knowledge of European operational procedures and EVA's insider intelligence to unmask dozens of agents embedded throughout American survivor factions. The work was brutal and morally ambiguous, requiring surveillance of Brotherhood members I had trusted, interrogations that sometimes revealed innocent people caught up in circumstantial evidence, and difficult decisions about how much information to share with other factions who might use it for political advantage rather than collective defense. The deeper we dug into European infiltration networks, the more we uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that stretched back over a century. European agents had been present during the formation of the new California Republic, subtly influencing constitutional frameworks to create governmental structures that European strategists believed would eventually collapse under bureaucratic inefficiency. European operatives had infiltrated early Brotherhood expeditions, stealing technical documentation and reporting on defensive capabilities while appearing to be loyal members. European intelligence had even made contact with enclave remnants, offering technological assistance in exchange for future alliance against what both factions characterized as inferior wasteland populations. The question that haunted me during those 3 years of counterintelligence work was simple but terrible. How many decisions made by American survivor factions over the past century had been genuinely their own, and how many had been manipulated by European agents working toward invasion objectives? Had the Brotherhood's isolationist tendencies been natural development, or encouraged by infiltrators who wanted to keep advanced technology concentrated in vulnerable, centralized locations? Had NCR's expansion policies been authentic democratic choices or subtle manipulation designed to overextend their military capabilities? Had factional conflicts that weakened American defensive unity been organic disagreements or deliberately provoked by agents with ulterior motives? If you discovered that someone you trusted completely had been secretly working against your interests for years, could you ever trust anyone again? That's the question every American survivor faction faced when they learned about European infiltration networks. By 2286, we had identified and removed most of the known sleeper agents, but the damage was done. American survivor factions now viewed each other with suspicion, wondering who else might be compromised, questioning decisions, and alliances that had seemed straightforward before European infiltration was revealed. The paranoia was exactly what European strategists wanted, weakening American unity and defensive coordination in the years before invasion. Even our successful counterintelligence operations served European objectives by creating the distrust and fragmentation that made conquest easier. I received one final communication from von Strauss in 2288, 2 years before the projected invasion date. The message was delivered through a captured European courier, written in the formal military style that characterized all official European correspondence. Von Strauss acknowledged my defection and counterintelligence activities, expressing what he characterized as disappointment rather than anger. He wrote that he had hoped I would eventually understand European perspective, would recognize that military dictatorship and genetic modification and ruthless efficiency weren't moral failures but necessary adaptations to post-war reality. He wrote that the invasion was coming regardless of my attempts to prepare American defenses, that technological and organizational superiority would prevail regardless of how many sleeper agents were exposed. But then, von Strauss wrote something that has stayed with me ever since, something that revealed the fundamental disconnect between European and American post-war philosophies. He wrote that American survivor factions had wasted 2 centuries pursuing democratic ideals and individual freedoms when they should have been building military strength and technological capability. He wrote that European deep shelters had survived by abandoning outdated notions of human rights and ethical constraints, by recognizing that survival required sacrifice of individual dignity for collective power. He wrote that when European forces finally landed on American shores, they would be doing Americans a favor by imposing the discipline and order that wasteland populations clearly could not create for themselves. Reading that letter, I finally understood the true horror of what European deep shelters had become. They had convinced themselves that totalitarian dictatorship was enlightened governance, that genetic experimentation on children was progressive science, that conquest of other survivors was humanitarian intervention. They had spent 2 centuries in isolation creating a culture so morally inverted that atrocity had become virtue, oppression had become liberation, and violent subjugation had become salvation. And they genuinely believed they were humanity's last hope, that their nightmare vision of militarized society represented the only viable path forward for post-war civilization. I'm recording this confession in 2290, the year European invasion forces are scheduled to arrive. I don't know if American defenses will be sufficient. I don't know if the intelligence Eva and I provided will make enough difference against 2 centuries of European military preparation. I don't know if the divisions between American factions can be overcome in time to present unified resistance against technologically superior invaders who view conquest as moral imperative. What I do know is that the sanitized narrative about American vaults being the only shelter system built to survive nuclear war is a dangerous lie, and that somewhere beneath the ruins of Europe, millions of enhanced soldiers are preparing to cross the Atlantic and impose their vision of civilization on whatever remains of humanity. If this confession meant something to you, leave a like. It's the only way I know you liked the video. The European deep shelters represent something more terrifying than any mutant creature or raider gang that American survivors have faced. They represent organized evil, refined through 200 years of isolation, equipped with superior technology, convinced of its own righteousness. They represent what happens when survival becomes the only value that matters, when efficiency replaces ethics, when military necessity justifies any atrocity. And they're coming, whether we're ready or not. Sometimes I stand on the California coast, looking east across the radioactive ocean, wondering if I'll see European naval vessels on the horizon. I think about my grandfather, who helped build the shelters that became prisons for entire generations. I think about my sister, who risked everything to expose the invasion she could no longer morally support. I think about all the children born in European deep shelters, raised in totalitarian nightmares, modified against their will to become weapons for wars they didn't choose. And I wonder if there's any path forward that doesn't end in more violence, more death, more centuries of humanity destroying itself in the name of survival. The lost European vaults aren't lost. They're waiting, planning, preparing, and the forgotten European survivors haven't forgotten anything. least of all their conviction that they deserve to inherit whatever remains of the world. Whether American survivors can stand against that conviction, whether we can defend the flawed but genuine attempts at democracy and freedom that characterize American wasteland societies, whether we can prove that there's value in messy, inefficient, but fundamentally humane civilization worth preserving against organized military dictatorship, that question will be answered soon enough. This is Dr. Klaus Richter, last surviving member of the European Deep Shelter Documentation Project, recording what may be my final testimony. If you're listening to this and European forces have already landed, remember that their technology and military superiority don't make them right. Remember that efficiency isn't the same as justice, that survival at any cost isn't actually survival if it requires abandoning everything that makes us human. And remember that even 2 centuries of preparation can't overcome the fundamental truth that civilizations built on oppression and atrocity eventually collapse under the weight of their own moral bankruptcy. The European invasion is coming. How America responds will determine whether post-war humanity has any future worth fighting for.